Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is let go of the only friend he has left in this world. When you've lost everything that matters, even a wild creature's loyalty can become the thread that keeps you from falling apart completely. Luke Merrick was a widowed cowboy who rode into Silver Bend with a massive grey wolf by his side. He'd raised the animal from a pup after finding it injured in the mountains. When a rancher's sheep turned up dead, Sheriff Cole gave Luke an order: kill the wolf by sundown. The whole town gathered to watch as Luke led his companion beyond the fence with his rifle. But instead of shooting, he cut the rope from the wolf's neck and whispered something no one could hear. The wolf walked into the hills and never looked back. Luke returned alone, with tears in his eyes. What did he whisper that changed everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Silver Bend like an old man's whiskers, soft and grey in the early light. Luke Merrick stood on the weathered porch of his modest cabin, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Around his neck, beneath his faded cotton shirt, hung a simple gold band on a leather cord, his wedding ring, worn close to his heart since the day he buried Sarah 3 winters past. The wolf lay stretched across the porch planks, massive paws hanging over the edge, yellow eyes tracking the movement of jackrabbits in the distance. At nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with a coat the color of storm clouds and intelligence that seemed almost human, the animal commanded both respect and wariness from anyone who encountered him. Luke had named him Ghost, though he rarely spoke the name aloud. Names were for companions, and Luke had learned the hard way that companions could be taken from you without warning. 3 years ago, Luke had been riding the high mountain trails, checking on stray cattle for the Morrison Ranch, when he heard the pitiful whimpering echoing from a rocky outcropping. Following the sound, he discovered a wolf pup, no more than 8 weeks old, trapped beneath a fallen log. Its left hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and dried blood matted the fur around a gash on its flank. The mother was nowhere to be seen, likely dead or driven off by hunters. Luke had stared at the injured creature for a long moment, remembering Sarah's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "Every living thing deserves a chance, Luke," she used to say, nursing injured birds back to health in their kitchen. "We don't get to decide who lives and who dies based on convenience." The memory of her gentle hands, tending to a broken-winged sparrow, had moved him to action. He'd fashioned a splint from willow branches and his own bandana, then carried the pup back to his cabin, wrapped in his coat. Those first weeks had been touch and go. The pup refused to eat, snapping weakly at Luke's hands whenever he tried to offer food. Doc Patterson, the town's physician who also tended to animals when needed, had shaken his graying head doubtfully. "Wild things sometimes choose death over captivity, Luke. Might be kinder to put the poor creature out of its misery." But Luke had persisted, sleeping on the floor beside the makeshift bed he'd created from old blankets, talking softly to the frightened animal through the long nights. He told the pup about Sarah, how she'd made the best apple pie in 3 counties, how her laugh could chase away his darkest moods, how she'd died calling his name while he was away on a cattle drive. The pup's ears would prick forward during these one-sided conversations, as if he understood that this man was sharing his deepest sorrows. The breakthrough came on a cold November morning when Luke woke to find the pup's muzzle resting against his outstretched hand. From that moment on, they were inseparable. As the wolf grew from a limping pup into a magnificent predator, their bond deepened beyond what Luke had thought possible with a wild animal. Ghost seemed to understand Luke's moods, offering silent companionship during his grief and standing alert during his moments of anxiety. Silver Bend was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody else's business, where the arrival of a stranger was cause for speculation and the departure of a long-time resident left a hole in the community's fabric. The town had grown up around a silver mine that played out 20 years prior, leaving behind a collection of weathered buildings and stubborn folks who refused to move on to greener pastures. Main Street boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, and Doc Patterson's combination medical office and barber shop. The sheriff's office anchored one end of the street, while the livery stable marked the other. Sheriff Cole Brennan had been keeping the peace in Silver Bend for nearly 2 decades. A tall, lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes the color of winter sky, Cole commanded respect through quiet authority rather than bluster. He'd known Luke since the younger man first arrived in town 7 years ago, drawn by Sarah's family connections and the promise of steady work on the surrounding ranches. Cole had officiated at Luke and Sarah's wedding, had been one of the pallbearers at her funeral, and had watched with growing concern as grief transformed the once sociable cowboy into a solitary figure on the town's periphery. "That wolf's getting mighty big," Cole had mentioned to Luke just last month, stroking his mustache in the way that signaled careful thought. "Folks are starting to talk." Luke had nodded, understanding the warning beneath the sheriff's mild tone. Ghost now weighed close to 120 pounds, with jaws capable of crushing bone and instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. To the townspeople, he represented something primal and unpredictable, a reminder that the wilderness was never truly tamed. Martha Henley ran the general store with the efficiency of a cavalry sergeant and the warmth of a beloved aunt. Her grey hair was always pinned in a tight bun, and her apron bore the accumulated stains of a woman who sampled her own merchandise regularly. She'd developed a soft spot for Luke after Sarah's death, often pressing extra supplies into his hands with a stern admonition to keep his strength up. Martha had been one of the few people who didn't immediately recoil when Ghost accompanied Luke into town. "Animals know good people from bad," she'd declared firmly when Mrs. Abernathy complained about the wolf's presence near the store. "That creature's never shown aggression to anyone, and I'll not have him or Luke made unwelcome in my establishment." Doc Patterson occupied a unique position in the town's hierarchy, serving as physician, veterinarian, barber, and unofficial counselor to anyone in need. A compact man in his 60s with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, he delivered half the children in Silver Bend and tended their ailments from cradle to grave. He alone among the townspeople had examined Ghost closely, marveling at the animal's intelligence and the obvious bond between man and wolf. "Never seen anything quite like it," he'd confided to Luke one evening. "That animal watches you the way a good dog watches his master, but there's something more there, something deeper. Sarah would have loved seeing this." The mention of Sarah always brought a mixture of pain and comfort to Luke's heart. She'd been the daughter of Silver Bend's former preacher, a woman whose compassion was matched only by her determination. Fair-haired and green-eyed, with a smile that could coax flowers to bloom in winter, Sarah had seen something in the quiet cowboy that others missed. Their courtship had been gentle and unhurried, built on long conversations and shared silences, on mutual respect and growing love. Their marriage had been brief but profoundly happy. Sarah had a gift for making their small cabin feel like a palace, for turning simple meals into celebrations, for finding joy in everyday moments. She'd talked often about children, about the family they would build together, about growing old on the front porch, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. The fever had taken her quickly, striking in early spring, when the weather couldn't decide between winter's chill and summer's warmth. Doc Patterson had done everything he could, but Sarah's body had been weakened by a hard winter and poor nutrition. Luke had held her hand as the life faded from her eyes, had whispered promises to love her always, had felt something fundamental break inside his chest when she drew her final breath. The months following Sarah's death had passed in a haze of grief and loneliness. Luke had continued working, driven by habit and the need to eat, but he'd withdrawn from the social fabric of Silver Bend. Church services, town meetings, even casual conversations at the general store had become ordeals to be endured rather than connections to be treasured. He'd begun taking longer and longer rides into the hills, seeking solitude among the pines and granite peaks where Sarah's absence didn't echo quite so loudly. It was during this period of self-imposed exile that Ghost had entered his life, a wounded creature who needed healing as much as Luke did. In caring for the wolf pup, Luke had rediscovered purpose beyond his own pain. The daily routine of feeding, grooming, and training had provided structure to his aimless days. The wolf's gradual recovery had mirrored Luke's own slow healing, though neither would ever be completely whole again. Now, standing on his porch in the early morning light, Luke watched Ghost raise his head at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A rider was making his way up the winding path to the cabin, dust trailing behind his horse like a brown ribbon. Luke recognized Tom Henley's bay gelding before he could make out the rider's features, and something in the man's urgent posture sent a chill down his spine. Ghost rose to his feet, muscles tensing beneath his grey coat, but he made no aggressive movement. The wolf had learned to read Luke's moods, and he sensed concern rather than threat in his human companion's stance. Luke's hand instinctively went to the gold ring beneath his shirt, seeking comfort in the tangible reminder of Sarah's love. As Tom Henley drew closer, Luke could see the agitation written in every line of the rancher's body. Henley was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of hard work and harder luck, with graying brown hair and eyes that held more worry than joy. His ranch bordered the Morrison spread, where Luke worked most frequently, and the two men had developed a cordial, if not warm, relationship over the years. "Luke!" Henley called out while still 50 yards away, his voice carrying a note of accusation that made Ghost's ears flatten slightly. "We need to talk." Luke stepped off the porch, one hand resting lightly on Ghost's head in a gesture that was both protective and calming. The wolf remained alert but relaxed, trusting in Luke's judgment. Whatever had brought Tom Henley to his door at this early hour, Luke sensed it would change everything. He touched the ring beneath his shirt one more time, drawing strength from Sarah's memory, and prepared to face whatever storm was approaching his peaceful morning. Tom Henley dismounted with the awkward haste of a man carrying bad news. His boots hit the ground hard, sending up small clouds of dust that drifted toward Luke and Ghost. The rancher's face was flushed with a mixture of anger and something else, fear, perhaps, or desperation. In his weathered hand, he clutched a tuft of bloodied wool. The white fibers stained dark red in the morning light. "3 of my sheep are dead, Luke," Henley announced without preamble, holding up the wool like evidence in a courtroom. "Torn to pieces in the night. And I found this caught on the fence post right next to where that wolf of yours likes to hunt." Luke felt his stomach drop, even as his mind began working through the implications. Ghost had indeed been absent from the cabin for several hours the previous evening, returning just before midnight with muddy paws and the satisfied air of a successful hunt, but sheep that made no sense. Ghost hunted rabbits, squirrels, the occasional deer. He'd never shown interest in livestock, never even approached the various flocks and herds that dotted the valley. "Now hold on, Tom," Luke said carefully, keeping his voice level despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "Just because you found some wool near where Ghost hunts doesn't mean..." "Doesn't mean what?" Henley's voice rose, causing Ghost to take a step closer to Luke's side. "That your pet wolf didn't do exactly what wolves do? Kill sheep? I've got 3 dead animals and a tuft of bloody wool, and your beast was roaming free last night. What more evidence do you need?" Luke knelt down and examined the wool more closely, noting the jagged tears and the amount of blood soaked into the fibers. The damage was extensive, suggesting a violent attack, but something about it struck him as wrong. Ghost was a precise hunter, efficient and clean. This looked more like the work of a pack, or perhaps dogs driven to frenzy. "Where exactly did you find this?" Luke asked, straightening up. "North pasture, near the creek crossing. You know the spot where your wolf goes to drink." Henley's accusation hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Sheriff's already been out to look at the carnage. He's calling a town meeting for this afternoon. The weight of those words settled on Luke's shoulders like a lead blanket. A town meeting meant public discussion, which meant fear would mix with facts until truth became impossible to distinguish. He'd seen it happen before, when old Pete Morrison's bull got loose and trampled Mrs. Henderson's garden. The town meeting had nearly ended with Pete being run out of Silver Bend entirely. "Tom, you've known me for 7 years. Have I ever given you reason to think I'd let Ghost hurt your livestock?" Henley's expression softened slightly, but the fear remained in his eyes. "It's not about you, Luke. It's about what that animal is. You can't change nature, and a wolf's nature is to kill." Before Luke could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention back to the main road. Sheriff Cole Brennan was riding up the path, accompanied by Doc Patterson and Martha from the general store. The grim set of Cole's jaw told Luke everything he needed to know about the seriousness of the situation. Ghost pressed closer against Luke's leg, sensing the tension that crackled through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Luke's hand found the wolf's head, fingers threading through the thick fur as he prepared for what was coming. "Morning, Luke," Sheriff Brennan said as he dismounted, his tone formal in a way that immediately established this as official business rather than a friendly visit. "I suppose Tom's told you about his sheep." "He has," Luke replied, "but I don't believe Ghost was responsible." Doc Patterson, who had examined the wolf multiple times and pronounced him remarkably well adapted to domestic life, looked troubled. "I saw the sheep, Luke. The wounds are consistent with large predator attacks, and Tom did find that wool where Ghost frequents." Martha, ever practical, stepped forward with her arms crossed. "Now see here, we've all known this wolf for years. He's never shown aggression toward livestock before. Why would he start now?" "Because he's getting older," Tom Henley interjected. "Stronger, more confident. Maybe he's tired of hunting rabbits and wants something bigger." Sheriff Brennan held up a hand to quiet the growing argument. "The fact remains that we have dead livestock and evidence pointing to Luke's wolf. The town's concerned, and rightfully so. People have children. Tom's livelihood depends on those sheep, and we can't have large predators running free if they're turning to killing domestic animals." Luke felt the walls closing in around him, the same suffocating sensation he'd experienced during Sarah's final illness, when the doctors had run out of options and could only watch helplessly as she slipped away. But this time, he wasn't helpless. He could fight for Ghost the way he'd been unable to fight for his wife. "What's the town meeting going to decide?" Luke asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sheriff Brennan's expression was pained, but resolute. "Luke, you know I respect you. You're a good man who's been through more than his share of trouble. But I've got to think about the safety of this community. If that wolf killed those sheep, he's demonstrated that he's dangerous to livestock. And if he's dangerous to livestock, he's dangerous to people. The town's going to want him put down," Martha said bluntly, her usual warmth replaced by practical realism. "I'm sorry, Luke, but that's how these things go. Fear wins out over logic every time." Ghost seemed to understand that he was the subject of discussion. His yellow eyes moved from face to face, reading the tension in their postures, the worry in their voices. He'd grown up around humans, had learned to interpret their moods and intentions, and something in this gathering told him that he was in danger. "I need time," Luke said, desperation creeping into his voice despite his efforts to remain calm. "Time to investigate, to find out what really happened to those sheep. Ghost didn't do this, and I can prove it if you give me a chance." Tom Henley shook his head. "I've got a ranch to run, Luke. I can't afford to lose more sheep while you go chasing theories. That wolf needs to be dealt with today." Sheriff Brennan removed his hat and ran his fingers through his grey hair, a gesture Luke recognized as the lawman's way of buying time to think. "I'll tell you what, Luke. The meeting's set for 2 o'clock. I'll give you until sundown to present any evidence you can find. But if you can't prove that wolf's innocence..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Doc Patterson stepped forward, his weathered face creased with sympathy. Luke, son, maybe it's time to consider that keeping a wild animal wasn't such a good idea. I know Ghost has been a comfort to you since Sarah passed, but perhaps, no. Luke's voice cut through the morning air with surprising force. Ghost isn't just some wild animal I picked up on a whim. He's family. He's all the family I have left. The admission hung in the air, raw and painful in its honesty. Martha's expression softened, and even Tom Henley looked uncomfortable with the naked grief in Luke's voice. Sheriff Brennan replaced his hat and gathered his reins. "Sundown, Luke. That's all the time I can give you. The town meeting will make the decision, but I suspect they'll want immediate action. You'd best use these hours wisely." As the group prepared to leave, Luke felt Ghost lean more heavily against his leg, seeking comfort in their contact. The wolf couldn't understand the words being spoken, but he could sense the threat that surrounded them both. Luke looked down into those intelligent yellow eyes and made a silent promise. He would find the truth, no matter what it cost him. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving Luke and Ghost alone on the porch where the morning had begun so peacefully. The bloodied wool lay forgotten in the dust at their feet, a small piece of evidence that threatened to destroy everything Luke had rebuilt from the ashes of his grief. He had until sundown to save the only friend he had left in the world. Luke stood on his porch long after the dust from the departing horses had settled, his mind racing through possibilities and probabilities. Ghost remained pressed against his leg, yellow eyes fixed on the distant hills, as if he too sensed that their peaceful life was about to change forever. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing the harsh reality of their situation with crystalline clarity. Moving with the deliberate calm that had carried him through Sarah's final days, Luke walked back into the cabin. The single room held the accumulated memories of his life. Sarah's quilt still folded neatly in the cedar chest, her books arranged on the shelf he'd built for their first anniversary, the kitchen table where they'd shared countless meals and quiet conversations. But it was to his Bible that Luke turned now, the worn leather cover soft beneath his weathered fingers. The letter fell out as he opened the book, just as it had every morning for the past 3 years. Sarah's handwriting, still crisp despite the yellowing paper, seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. She'd written it during one of her rare moments of strength in those final weeks, when the fever had temporarily receded and her mind had cleared. "My dearest Luke," the letter began, "I know you're reading this after I'm gone, and I know you're hurting in ways that words can't touch. But I need you to remember something important. Every living creature that crosses our path is put there for a reason. The injured bird, the lost calf, the wolf pup that will someday find you in the mountains. We don't get to choose who deserves our protection based on what's convenient or what others think is proper. Love isn't always easy, and sometimes it requires us to stand alone against the world. But that's when it matters most. Protect the innocent, Luke, especially when no one else will. That's how we honor the gift of life we've been given." Luke's hands trembled as he refolded the letter and placed it carefully back between the pages of Psalms. Sarah had always possessed an uncanny ability to see into the future, to understand what he would need to hear long before he knew he needed to hear it. Her words seemed written specifically for this moment, this impossible choice between his place in the community and his loyalty to an innocent creature. Ghost had followed him into the cabin and now sat at his feet, head tilted in that peculiar way that suggested he was listening to something beyond human hearing. Luke knelt down and took the wolf's massive head between his hands, looking directly into those intelligent yellow eyes. "Sarah knew you were coming," he said softly. "She knew I'd need you, and she knew you'd need me. I'm not going to let them take you away from me, not without a fight." The wolf's tail moved once, a subtle acknowledgement of the words, if not their meaning. Ghost had learned to read Luke's emotions with remarkable accuracy, and he sensed determination where moments before there had been despair. Luke retrieved his rifle from its place above the fireplace, checking the action and ammunition from long habit. But this weapon would be for protection, not execution. He had no intention of using it on Ghost, regardless of what the town demanded. Instead, he planned to use the remaining hours to find the real killer of Tom Henley's sheep. The ride to Henley's north pasture took 20 minutes across rolling hills, dotted with scrub, oak, and pine. Ghost loped alongside Luke's horse with the easy grace of a creature born to cover long distances, never falling behind despite the steady pace. The wolf's presence was both a comfort and a liability. If anyone saw them together, it would only reinforce the belief that Luke was harboring a dangerous predator. The scene of the attack lay just beyond a small creek, in a natural depression where sheep often gathered to graze on the tender grass that grew near the water. Luke dismounted and surveyed the area with the methodical attention of a man whose life might depend on what he discovered. 3 sheep lay scattered across perhaps 50 yards, their wool matted with dried blood and their bodies showing the massive trauma that had killed them. But as Luke examined the wounds more closely, inconsistencies began to emerge. The bite marks were indeed from large predators, but they varied in size and depth in ways that suggested multiple attackers rather than a single wolf. Ghost approached one of the carcasses, sniffing carefully, but showing no particular interest beyond normal canine curiosity. If he had killed these animals, Luke reasoned, there would be some recognition, some lingering scent that would engage his attention. Instead, the wolf seemed puzzled by the carnage, his body language suggesting confusion rather than familiarity. Moving in ever-widening circles around the attack site, Luke began to piece together the story written in tracks and disturbed earth. The sheep had been grazing peacefully when the attack began. Their scattered positions and the lack of defensive wounds suggested they'd been taken by surprise. But the tracks told a more complex story than Tom Henley's simple accusation. Near the creek, Luke found the clear impression of a wolf's paw in the soft mud, but it was smaller than Ghost's massive feet, and the gait pattern suggested a different animal entirely. More troubling were the other tracks he discovered, the unmistakable prints of domestic dogs, at least 3 of them, running together in the coordinated pattern of a pack. A tuft of black fur caught on a low branch provided another piece of the puzzle. Ghost's coat was uniformly grey, with no black markings anywhere on his body. Luke carefully extracted the fur and examined it in the sunlight, noting its coarse texture and the way it differed from his wolf's softer undercoat. The discovery of several empty bottles partially buried in the tall grass near the fence line added another dimension to the mystery. The bottles had contained whiskey, and they were recent, the labels still intact, and the glass free of the weathering that would come from prolonged exposure. Someone had been drinking heavily in this pasture, and recently, Ghost had wandered to the fence line and was sniffing intently at something Luke couldn't see. Following the wolf's attention, Luke discovered scratches in the wooden fence post that looked fresh. The marks were too high to have been made by sheep, too low for cattle, but exactly the right height for a man who might have stumbled against the post while intoxicated. A chill ran down Luke's spine as the implications began to coalesce. The evidence suggested that someone had been drinking in this pasture, possibly on the night of the attack. The sheep had been killed by multiple predators, a pack of dogs, rather than a single wolf. And someone had planted that bloodied wool where Ghost was known to hunt, ensuring that suspicion would fall on the wolf rather than the real killers. But who would do such a thing? And why? Luke's investigation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Doc Patterson emerged from the tree line, riding slowly and calling out in greeting. The physician's presence was both welcome and troubling welcome, because Doc was one of the few people who might listen to evidence. Troubling, because it meant word of Luke's investigation was already spreading through town. "Thought I might find you here," Doc said as he dismounted. "Tom Henley's been telling anyone who'll listen that you're out here trying to cover up evidence." Luke held up the black fur and the whiskey bottles. "I'm not covering up evidence, Doc. I'm finding it." Doc Patterson dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had spent more years in a saddle than he cared to count. His weathered face bore the expression of someone who had seen enough of life's injustices to recognize another one in the making. As Luke showed him the evidence, the mismatched tracks, the black fur, the whiskey bottles, the physician's frown deepened. "This is troubling, Luke," Doc said, examining the fur sample through his wire-rimmed spectacles. "This didn't come from Ghost, that's certain. But convincing the town of that is going to be another matter entirely." Luke carefully collected the evidence in his saddlebags, knowing that physical proof would be essential when facing the fear and anger that would dominate the town meeting. Ghost remained near the creek, occasionally lifting his head to test the wind, but showing no signs of distress or guilt that might suggest familiarity with the carnage. "There's something else," Doc continued, lowering his voice as if the empty pasture might have ears. "I examined those sheep more closely after Tom brought them in. The bite patterns don't match what I'd expect from a single wolf. The wounds are too varied, too chaotic. It looks more like the work of domestic dogs gone feral, the kind that attack in packs and kill for sport rather than food." This confirmation of Luke's own observations brought both relief and growing concern. If Ghost wasn't responsible, then someone else was someone who had deliberately planted evidence to implicate an innocent animal. But who in Silver Bend would orchestrate such deception, and why? The answer to that question would have to wait. As they prepared to leave the scene, Luke noticed storm clouds gathering on the western horizon. The afternoon thunderstorms that frequently swept across the valley would complicate his investigation, potentially washing away tracks and scattering additional evidence. Time was running short in more ways than one. The ride back toward town took them past the Morrison Ranch, where Luke had worked steadily for the past 3 years. The sight of the familiar buildings and corrals brought a pang of nostalgia for simpler times, when his biggest concern had been mending fence or tracking strays. Ghost had often accompanied him to the ranch, becoming a familiar sight to the other hands, and proving his gentle nature around horses and cattle. It was there they encountered Martha from the general store, driving her supply wagon back from a delivery to the Morrison Ranch house. Her usually cheerful demeanor was subdued, and she pulled her horses to a halt when she spotted Luke and Doc approaching. "Luke, honey," she called out, genuine concern evident in her voice. "The whole town's buzzing about this afternoon's meeting. Folks are scared, and scared people don't always think clearly." Luke drew his horse alongside her wagon, Ghost taking his usual position slightly behind and to the left, where he could observe without seeming threatening. "What are they saying, Martha?" "Tom Henley's been holding court at the saloon since noon, telling anyone who'll listen about the savage attack on his sheep. Each telling gets a little more dramatic, a little more frightening. By now, you'd think Ghost had single-handedly decimated half the livestock in the county." Doc Patterson adjusted his spectacles and spoke carefully. "Martha, Luke's found some evidence that suggests the wolf might not be responsible for this attack." Martha's expression brightened with hope. "Well, that's wonderful news. What kind of evidence?" Luke showed her the black fur and explained about the mismatched tracks and the whiskey bottles. Martha examined each piece with the practical attention of a woman who had spent her life evaluating merchandise and assessing the honesty of those who sold it to her. "This fur definitely didn't come from Ghost," she agreed. "But Luke, you know as well as I do that evidence won't matter much if people have already made up their minds. Fear has a way of drowning out facts." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching riders reached their ears. A group of townspeople was heading their way, led by Tom Henley, and including several ranchers whose faces Luke recognized, but whose support he couldn't count on. The men rode with the grim determination of a posse, and their eyes fixed on Ghost with unmistakable hostility. Luke's hand instinctively moved to the silver locket he wore alongside Sarah's ring, a tarnished piece that contained her photograph. In moments of crisis, he often found himself clutching it, drawing strength from her memory and the love they had shared. Sarah had always believed in standing up for what was right, even when it meant standing alone. "Luke Merrick," Tom Henley called out as the group drew near. "I heard you were out at my pasture. disturbing the scene of the crime. "I was investigating," Luke replied calmly, "and I found evidence that suggests Ghost isn't responsible for killing your sheep." One of the other ranchers, a man named Pete Garrison, with a reputation for quick judgments and quicker temper, spat into the dust. "Evidence. The evidence is 3 dead sheep and a wolf that was roaming free the night they died. What more evidence do you need?" Luke began to explain about the mismatched tracks and the black fur, but he could see that the men weren't interested in listening. Their minds were already made up, their fear of the unknown transforming Ghost from a familiar presence into a mortal threat. "That animal's gotten too comfortable around humans," another rancher added. "Wild things that lose their fear become dangerous. It's just nature taking its course." Ghost seemed to sense the growing hostility, pressing closer to Luke's horse and lowering his head in a gesture that Luke recognized as submission rather than aggression. The wolf was trying to appear less threatening, but his very size and predatory grace made that nearly impossible. "The town meeting's been moved up," Tom Henley announced with grim satisfaction. "Sheriff Brennan wants to settle this matter before the afternoon storms hit, 1 o'clock at the church." Luke felt the walls closing in around him. With the meeting moved up, he would have less time to present his evidence, less opportunity to convince people who had already decided Ghost's fate. The investigation that had started with such promise was being truncated by fear and impatience. As the group of ranchers rode away toward town, Martha reached out to touch Luke's arm. "Don't give up, honey. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when folks try to bury it." Doc Patterson nodded in agreement. "I'll speak up at the meeting, Luke. The medical evidence supports your theory about multiple attackers." But Luke could see the doubt in their eyes, the growing realization that good intentions might not be enough to save Ghost from the town's fear. The locket felt cold against his chest, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he wondered if love and loyalty would be sufficient weapons against the forces arrayed against them. The clock was ticking, and Ghost's life hung in the balance. The Silver Bend Church sat at the heart of the town like a weathered sentinel, its white clapboard walls and simple bell tower speaking to the practical faith of frontier people. By the time Luke arrived with Ghost at his side, a crowd had already gathered in the dusty yard outside. Men clustered in tight groups, their voices low and urgent, while women kept their children close and cast nervous glances at the wolf. Luke dismounted and secured his horse to the hitching post, acutely aware of the hostile stares directed their way. Ghost remained calm but alert, his yellow eyes scanning the crowd with the intelligent wariness of a creature that understood he was the subject of their gathering. The wolf's ears were pricked forward, catching fragments of conversation that carried on the afternoon breeze. Sheriff Brennan emerged from the church and approached Luke with the measured steps of a man carrying an unpleasant duty. His weathered face bore the weight of years spent making difficult decisions, and Luke could see the conflict in his steel-gray eyes. "Luke, I need to ask you to tie the wolf up during the meeting," the sheriff said quietly. "People are nervous enough without having him free to roam around." Luke nodded reluctantly and secured Ghost to the hitching post with a length of rope, the same frayed leather cord that had bound them together for 3 years. The wolf settled at the base of the post with resigned dignity, as if he understood that this indignity was temporary and necessary. Inside the church, the pews filled quickly with nearly every adult resident of Silver Bend. Luke took a seat near the back, close enough to the door that he could keep an eye on Ghost through the window. The familiar smell of old wood and candle wax brought memories of attending services with Sarah, of the hope and peace they had found in this simple sanctuary. Now the same space felt charged with tension and barely contained fear. Tom Henley sat in the front pew, flanked by his wife and several other ranchers. Even from the back of the church, Luke could see the man's agitation in the set of his shoulders and the way his hands moved restlessly in his lap. Near the ranchers sat an empty whiskey bottle that someone had apparently brought as evidence, though Luke noticed it was a different brand from the bottles he had found at the attack site. Sheriff Brennan called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of his gavel against the pulpit. We're here to discuss the incident at the Henley Ranch and determine what action, if any, should be taken regarding Luke Merrick's wolf. Action? Pete Garrison stood up, his face flushed with indignation. 3 sheep are dead, Sheriff. The action's pretty clear to me. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation, but Sheriff Brennan held up his hand for silence. Everyone will have a chance to speak. Tom, why don't you start by telling us exactly what happened? Tom Henley rose slowly, and Luke was struck by how much older the rancher looked than he had that morning. Deep lines of worry etched his face, and his clothes bore the rumpled appearance of a man who hadn't slept well in days. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that might have been anger or fear. I found 3 of my best ewes dead in the north pasture this morning, Henley began. Torn to pieces they were, throats ripped out, bellies opened. It was the most savage thing I've ever seen, and I've been ranching for 25 years. Luke listened carefully to Henley's account, noting discrepancies between this version and what the rancher had told him earlier. The details seemed to shift with each telling, becoming more dramatic and horrific. But it was Henley's hands that caught Luke's attention. They shook slightly as he gestured, and Luke caught the faint smell of whiskey on the man's breath, even from several pews away. I found wool caught on the fence post, right where that wolf likes to hunt, Henley continued. Bloodied wool from my sheep, and everyone knows that once a predator gets a taste for easy prey like livestock, it won't stop. Doc Patterson stood up when Henley finished. Sheriff, I examined those sheep, and I have some concerns about the nature of the wounds. What kind of concerns? Sheriff Brennan asked. The bite patterns suggest multiple attackers, not a single wolf. The wounds are too varied, too chaotic. In my professional opinion, those sheep were killed by a pack of domestic dogs that have gone feral. The statement sent a ripple of surprise through the congregation. Several people turned to look at their neighbors, perhaps wondering whose dogs might be responsible. But Pete Garrison shook his head dismissively. Dogs or wolf, what's the difference? We've got a predator problem, and it needs to be dealt with. Luke stood up, feeling every eye in the church turned toward him. The difference is that you're about to execute an innocent animal based on false evidence. He walked to the front of the church and placed the black fur and the whiskey bottles he had found on the pulpit. I found these at the attack site. This fur didn't come from Ghost. It's the wrong color and texture, and these bottles suggest someone was drinking heavily in that pasture, possibly on the night of the attack. Tom Henley's face went pale at the sight of the whiskey bottles. Those could have been there for weeks, he said quickly. Drifters, maybe, or cowboys passing through. But Luke had noticed something else about the bottles. They were the same brand that Tom Henley favored, the kind sold exclusively at Peterson's saloon. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Tom Henley had been drinking in his own pasture, possibly passed out drunk while his sheep were attacked by wild dogs. The bloodied wool had been planted to deflect suspicion from his own negligence. The understanding must have shown on Luke's face, because Henley suddenly stood up with surprising violence. "This is all speculation," he shouted. "We have a dangerous predator in our midst, and instead of dealing with it, we're chasing fantasies about mysterious dogs and planted evidence." Martha stood up from her pew, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. "Tom Henley, you're so eager to blame that wolf that you won't even consider other possibilities. I've known Ghost for 3 years, and he's never shown aggression toward anything but rabbits and squirrels." "Animals change," Henley shot back. "Wild things can't be trusted." Luke watched the rancher's face carefully, seeing desperation beneath the anger. Tom Henley was a man drowning in problems, financial troubles, a failing ranch, a drinking problem that was getting worse. The death of his sheep represented not just a loss of livestock, but a potential catastrophe for a man already operating on the edge of ruin. Sheriff Brennan called for order, but Luke could see that the room was dividing into 2 camps, those who feared Ghost based on his nature as a predator, and those who knew him well enough to doubt his guilt. The evidence Luke had presented was compelling, but fear was a powerful force that often overwhelmed logic. As the debate raged around him, Luke found himself thinking about Sarah's words about protecting the innocent when no one else would. Outside the window, he could see Ghost lying patiently by the hitching post, trusting in Luke's ability to save him. The weight of that trust was both inspiring and terrifying. The argument in the church continued to escalate, voices rising and tempers flaring as the town struggled to reach a decision. Luke could see that his evidence, while compelling to those willing to listen, wasn't enough to overcome the deep-seated fear that gripped many of the townspeople. Ghost represented something primal and unpredictable to them, a reminder that the wilderness was never truly conquered. Feeling the weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders, Luke quietly slipped out of the church. The afternoon sun felt harsh on his face as he walked to where Ghost waited patiently by the hitching post. The wolf raised his head at Luke's approach, yellow eyes reflecting a trust that made Luke's chest tighten with emotion. "We need to find a different kind of help," Luke murmured, untying the rope from the post. "Come on, boy, let's go talk to someone who might understand." The ride to the cemetery took them away from the chaos of the town meeting, through rolling hills dotted with wildflowers that Sarah had loved. The Silver Bend Cemetery occupied a peaceful rise overlooking the valley, marked by a simple wooden fence and scattered headstones that told the story of the community's struggles and triumphs. Sarah's grave lay beneath a spreading oak tree, marked by a wooden cross that Luke had carved himself during the long winter months following her death. The cross bore only her name and the years of her brief life, but every line and curve had been shaped with love and grief in equal measure. Luke dismounted and approached the grave slowly, Ghost at his side. The wolf had been here many times before, during Luke's regular visits, and he seemed to understand the solemnity of the place. Ghost settled at the base of the oak tree, keeping watch while Luke knelt beside Sarah's resting place. "I don't know what to do," Luke said softly, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the oak leaves. "They want to take him from me. Sarah. They want to kill him for something he didn't do, and I can't seem to make them understand." The wooden cross stood silent sentinel over the grave, offering no answers, but somehow providing comfort through its simple presence. Luke traced the carved letters of Sarah's name with one finger, remembering her voice, her laugh, the way she had always found hope, even in the darkest moments. "You told me to protect the innocent," he continued, "but what if protecting him means losing everything else? What if they drive us both away from Silver Bend? This is where you are, Sarah. This is where our life together happened. How can I leave you behind?" A hawk circled overhead, its cry echoing across the hills like an answer to his questions. Sarah had always believed that signs came when you needed them most, that the natural world spoke to those who knew how to listen. Luke wasn't sure he believed in such things, but the hawk's presence brought him a measure of peace. Ghost suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward at some sound Luke couldn't hear. Following the wolf's gaze, Luke saw a rider approaching across the cemetery grounds. It was Doc Patterson, his weathered face creased with concern and something that might have been urgency. "Luke," Doc called out as he dismounted near the cemetery gate. "I've been looking for you. The meeting's taken a turn." Luke rose from beside Sarah's grave, brushing dust from his knees. "What kind of turn? Tom Henley's having some kind of breakdown," Doc explained as he approached. "Started ranting about debts and failed crops, drinking problems and shame. Sheriff Brennan had to calm him down. The man's falling apart." This news confirmed Luke's growing suspicions about Henley's role in the night's events. A man drowning in financial troubles and alcohol might well leave his sheep unprotected, then attempt to cover his negligence by blaming an innocent animal. "Did he admit to anything?" Luke asked. Doc shook his head. "Not directly, but he's acting like a man carrying a heavy burden of guilt. Sheriff Brennan postponed the final decision until tomorrow morning, said he wanted time to investigate your evidence more thoroughly." Relief flooded through Luke, followed quickly by renewed determination. A reprieve wasn't a pardon, but it gave him more time to uncover the truth. He looked down at Ghost, who was watching the conversation with the alert attention of a creature that understood his fate hung in the balance. "There's something else," Doc continued. "Martha mentioned seeing a pack of stray dogs near her place last week. Said they were acting strange, aggressive-like. She didn't think much of it at the time, but now it fits the pattern," Luke finished. "Wild dogs, Henley drinking and leaving his sheep unprotected, planted evidence to cover his negligence." Doc nodded grimly. "The pieces are falling into place, but proving it is another matter. Tom Henley's been a member of this community for decades. People are more inclined to believe a rancher than to trust a wolf." Luke's hand went instinctively to the wooden cross, drawing strength from its presence and from the memory of Sarah's unwavering faith in doing what was right. She had never backed down from a challenge when principles were at stake, had never chosen the easy path when the right path was available. "Then we need to find those dogs," Luke said with renewed resolve. "If they're still in the area, they might attack again, and when they do, we'll be ready to prove Ghost's innocence." The plan was dangerous. Allowing more livestock to be attacked went against every instinct Luke possessed. But if they could catch the real killers in the act, it would provide the undeniable proof needed to save Ghost's life. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Luke paused for one last look at Sarah's grave. The wooden cross stood strong against the afternoon sky, a testament to love that endured beyond death. He had carved it during his darkest hours, when grief threatened to overwhelm him completely. Now it served as a reminder that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. "We're going to find the truth," he promised Sarah's memory, "and we're going to save him." Ghost rose from his position beneath the oak tree, somehow sensing that their vigil was ending and their real fight was about to begin. The wolf's yellow eyes held the same trust they had shown for 3 years, the same faith in Luke's ability to protect what mattered most. Together, they rode away from the cemetery and back toward town, where the battle for Ghost's life would be won or lost in the coming hours. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills when Luke and Doc Patterson returned to town, the shadows growing longer and the air taking on the golden quality that marked the transition from afternoon to evening. The streets of Silver Bend were unusually quiet, most residents having returned to their homes after the heated town meeting, though clusters of men still stood outside the saloon, engaged in animated discussion. Luke was preparing to stable his horse when the sound of rapid hoofbeats drew his attention to the main road. A rider was approaching at a dangerous pace, his horse lathered with sweat and stumbling with exhaustion. As the figure drew closer, Luke recognized young Billy Morrison, the 16-year-old son of the ranch owner where Luke worked most frequently. "Mr. Merrick," Billy called out as he pulled his horse to a sliding stop in front of the livery stable. "You got to come quick. My pa sent me to find you." Luke caught the horse's bridle, steadying the exhausted animal while Billy dismounted on shaking legs. The boy's face was pale with exertion and something else, fear perhaps, or shock. "What's wrong, Billy? What happened?" "It's Mr. Henley," the boy gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "He came riding up to our place about an hour ago, acting all strange and desperate-like. Started confessing to my pa about something terrible he'd done." Doc Patterson, who had been preparing to leave, quickly dismounted and approached the group. Ghost, sensing the urgency in the air, pressed closer to Luke's side, yellow eyes alert and focused. "What kind of confession?" Doc asked, his medical training making him naturally attuned to signs of distress and crisis. Billy wiped sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand, said he'd been drinking heavy in his north pasture the night his sheep got killed, passed out drunk and left the gate to the pen wide open. When he woke up the next morning, he found his sheep dead and a pack of wild dogs running off into the hills. Luke felt his heart begin to race as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. This was the confirmation he had hoped for, the truth that would vindicate Ghost and expose the deception that had nearly cost an innocent life. "But that's not the worst part," Billy continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Mr. Henley said he was so scared of losing his ranch he owes money all over the county that he decided to blame your wolf instead of admitting he'd been negligent. He planted that bloody wool where Ghost likes to hunt, figuring no one would question it. The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through Luke's mind with stunning clarity. Tom Henley had deliberately framed Ghost, had orchestrated an elaborate deception to cover his own failures and protect his failing ranch from the consequences of his drinking. Doc Patterson let out a long, low whistle. Tom Henley planted evidence to frame an innocent animal. I never would have believed it if I hadn't heard it myself. "Where is Henley now?" Luke asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Billy's expression grew even more troubled. "That's just it, Mr. Merrick. After he finished confessing to my pa, he pulled out a piece of paper and started writing like his life depended on it. Said it was a confession that would clear your wolf of any wrongdoing. But then he just broke down. Started crying and carrying on about how he'd ruined everything, how his wife would never forgive him, how the whole town would run him out once they learned the truth." Luke's anger at Henley's deception was tempered by a growing concern for the man's well-being. A confession written under such emotional duress might not be legally binding, and if Henley harmed himself before Sheriff Brennan could take his statement, Ghost would remain under suspicion. "Did he say where he was going?" Luke pressed. "Back to his ranch, I think. But Mr. Merrick, he was talking strange. Said something about making things right, about paying for what he'd done. My pa was worried enough to send me to find Sheriff Brennan." Doc Patterson was already moving toward his horse. "We need to get to the Henley place immediately. A man in Tom's state of mind might do something desperate." Luke hesitated, torn between the need to help a neighbor in crisis and the instinct to protect Ghost from any further danger. The wolf seemed to sense his internal conflict, pressing against his leg in the gesture of support that had become familiar over their years together. "Billy, did your father keep that confession?" Luke asked. The boy nodded and pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. "He told me to make sure this got to Sheriff Brennan, no matter what. Said it might be the only thing that saves your wolf." Luke unfolded the paper with trembling hands, reading the hastily scrawled words that would change everything. Tom Henley's handwriting was shaky but legible, each word a nail in the coffin of the deception he had constructed. "I, Thomas Henley, being of sound mind and guilty conscience, do hereby confess that I falsely accused Luke Merrick's wolf of killing my sheep. The truth is that I was drunk in my north pasture on the night of September 15th, and I failed to secure the sheep pen properly. Wild dogs killed my livestock while I lay unconscious from drink. In my shame and fear of financial ruin, I planted bloody wool near where the wolf hunts, hoping to deflect blame from my own negligence. Luke Merrick and his wolf are completely innocent of any wrongdoing. I pray that God and this community can forgive me for this terrible deception." The confession was signed with Tom Henley's full name and dated that very day. It was exactly the evidence Luke needed to clear Ghost's name and restore his place in the community. But the circumstances under which it had been written filled him with dread about what they might find at the Henley Ranch. Sheriff Brennan emerged from his office, apparently summoned by the commotion in the street. His weathered face took on a grim expression as he read the confession and listened to Billy's account of Henley's breakdown. "This changes everything," the sheriff said, folding the paper carefully and placing it in his vest pocket. "Luke, your wolf is cleared of all charges. But we need to get to Tom's place immediately. A man who's committed this kind of deception might not stop at confession." Luke mounted his horse quickly, Ghost falling into his accustomed position alongside. Doc Patterson and Sheriff Brennan flanked them as they rode hard toward the Henley Ranch, the confession in Brennan's pocket representing both vindication and a new source of worry. The Henley Ranch lay 3 miles south of town, a modest spread that had seen better days. As they approached the main house, Luke could see that something was wrong. The front door stood open, swaying in the evening breeze, and Tom Henley's horse wandered loose in the yard, still saddled but riderless. They found Henley sitting on the front steps of his house, his head in his hands and his shoulders shaking with sobs. Beside him lay an empty whiskey bottle and what appeared to be a loaded rifle. The man looked up as they approached, his face streaked with tears and his eyes red with grief and shame. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so damned sorry for what I did to you and that wolf. I was desperate, scared of losing everything, and I made a terrible choice." Sheriff Brennan dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun, but his posture non-threatening. "Tom, we have your confession. Luke's wolf is cleared. Now we need to make sure you're safe." Henley looked at the rifle beside him, then back at the group of men who had come to help rather than condemn him. "I thought about it," he admitted. "Thought it might be easier than facing what comes next, but I suppose I owe it to everyone I've wronged to see this through properly." Luke dismounted and approached Henley carefully, Ghost remaining by the horses but watching intently. "Tom, we all make mistakes when we're desperate. What matters now is making it right." The confession had vindicated Ghost and exposed the truth, but it had also revealed the depth of one man's desperation and the lengths to which fear could drive ordinary people. As the evening shadows lengthened around the Henley ranch, Luke realized that this crisis had taught him something profound about the complexity of human nature and the power of truth to both destroy and heal. The ride back to Silver Bend took place in contemplative silence, Tom Henley's confession safely secured in Sheriff Brennan's vest pocket like a talisman of truth. Henley himself rode between the sheriff and Doc Patterson, his shoulders hunched with shame, but his posture suggesting a man who had found a measure of peace in finally telling the truth. Luke brought up the rear with Ghost loping alongside, the wolf's presence no longer a source of controversy, but a vindicated companion. As they crested the hill overlooking the town, Luke could see that word of the confession had already begun to spread. Small groups of people stood in doorways and on porches, their faces turned toward the approaching riders, with expressions of curiosity and, in some cases, embarrassment. The speed with which gossip traveled in Silver Bend was legendary, and Luke suspected that by morning everyone would know the full story of Tom Henley's deception and Ghost's innocence. Sheriff Brennan had prepared the official documents that would clear Luke and Ghost of all charges, papers that represented far more than mere legal vindication. The Freedom Papers, as Doc Patterson had dubbed them, symbolized the community's acknowledgement that fear had nearly led them to commit a grave injustice. But even as relief flooded through Luke's system, a deeper realization was taking root in his mind. Ghost's innocence had been proven beyond doubt, but the events of the past day had revealed something troubling about the community's relationship with the wolf. The speed with which people had been willing to believe the worst, their eagerness to condemn based on suspicion rather than evidence, suggested that Ghost would never truly be safe in Silver Bend. There would always be another incident, another moment of crisis when fear would override reason. As they reached the edge of town, Martha emerged from her general store and hurried toward them, her face bright with relief and vindication. She had been one of Ghost's staunchest defenders during the town meeting, and Luke could see the satisfaction in her eyes as she realized that her faith had been justified. "Luke," she called out, slightly out of breath from her rapid approach, "is it true? Did Tom Henley really confess to framing Ghost?" Sheriff Brennan answered before Luke could respond. "It's true, Martha. We have a signed confession admitting to the deception. Luke's wolf is completely cleared of any wrongdoing." Martha's face broke into a wide smile, but Luke noticed that her expression quickly shifted to concern as she studied his face more closely. The older woman had known him since his arrival in Silver Bend, had watched him court and marry Sarah, had supported him through his grief, and she possessed an uncanny ability to read his moods. "You don't look as happy as I expected," she observed quietly. "Something else is troubling you." Luke dismounted and secured his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, Ghost taking his familiar position nearby. The wolf seemed relaxed for the first time since the crisis began, but there was still an alertness in his posture that suggested he sensed undercurrents in the human drama around him. "Martha, can I ask you something?" Luke said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision he was contemplating. "In all honesty, do you think the people of this town will ever truly accept Ghost? Will there always be suspicion, always be fear, waiting to surface the next time something goes wrong?" Martha's smile faded as she considered the question seriously. She was a practical woman who had spent decades observing human nature in all its complexity, and she understood the implications of what Luke was asking. "People have long memories for fear," she said finally. "Even with the truth out, there will be those who remember their terror more clearly than the facts. And there will always be the next Tom Henley, the next crisis that makes people look for someone to blame." Her words confirmed what Luke had been thinking during the long ride back to town. Ghost's legal vindication didn't erase the fundamental problem. He was a wild predator living in a community of people who would never fully trust him. The wolf's very nature, his size and strength and predatory grace, would always make him a target when fear overrode reason. Doc Patterson, who had been listening to the conversation while helping Tom Henley dismount, approached with the measured steps of a man choosing his words carefully. "Luke, I've been thinking about what happened today, about how quickly people were willing to believe the worst about Ghost. And I keep coming back to something Sarah once said to me." Luke looked up sharply at the mention of his wife's name. Doc Patterson had been one of Sarah's closest friends, often engaging her in philosophical discussions about life, nature, and the responsibilities of human beings toward other creatures. "What did she say?" "She told me once that the greatest act of love is sometimes letting go of what you cherish most. She was talking about her birds at the time, how she nursed them back to health and then released them to fly free, even though she would have loved to keep them close. She said that true love doesn't possess, it liberates." The words hit Luke with the force of revelation, echoing the letter Sarah had left him and confirming the growing conviction that had been building in his heart throughout the day. Ghost had been cleared of wrongdoing, but he would never be truly free as long as he remained tethered to human society. The wolf's nature demanded something more than legal vindication. It demanded the freedom to be what he was meant to be. Sheriff Brennan finished securing Tom Henley in the jail, not as a prisoner, but as a man needing protection from his own despair and the potential anger of those he had deceived. The sheriff approached Luke with the freedom papers in hand, official documents that would restore Ghost's legal status and guarantee his safety within the community. "These papers clear you and Ghost of all charges," Brennan said, offering the documents to Luke. "The town council will need to officially approve them tomorrow morning, but it's just a formality. Your wolf is free to remain in Silver Bend without any restrictions." Luke took the papers with hands that trembled slightly, not from relief, but from the weight of the decision he was contemplating. The documents represented everything he had fought for during the past day. Ghost's innocence, his right to remain in the community, the restoration of their peaceful life together. But as he looked down at Ghost, who was watching him with those intelligent yellow eyes, Luke realized that legal freedom was not the same as true freedom. The wolf had spent 3 years of his life bound to human society, protected by Luke's care, but constrained by the expectations and fears of the community around them. He had grown from a wounded pup into a magnificent predator, but he had never experienced the full scope of what it meant to be wild. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, reminding Luke of the evening when he had first found Ghost as an injured pup in the mountains. The wolf had been broken then, dependent on human intervention for survival. Now he was strong, healthy, and capable of living the life nature had intended for him. "Sheriff," Luke said quietly, "I appreciate these papers, but I need some time to think about what's best for Ghost." Brennan's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Luke, you fought all day to prove his innocence. Why would you hesitate now?" Luke folded the papers carefully and placed them in his shirt pocket, next to his heart, where Sarah's ring and locket rested. because proving his innocence and ensuring his happiness might be two different things. As the evening shadows lengthened around them, Luke made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would spend one final night with Ghost, sharing the quiet companionship that had sustained them both through years of grief and healing. And then, at dawn, he would give his friend the greatest gift he could offer, the freedom to choose his own path. The crisis that had threatened to destroy them had instead revealed a deeper truth about the nature of love and sacrifice. Sometimes the hardest thing a man could do was let go of the only friend he had left in the world. But sometimes that was exactly what love demanded. Dawn came slowly to Silver Bend, painting the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and gold that reminded Luke of Sarah's gentle smile. He had spent the night on his porch with Ghost lying beside him, both of them watching the stars wheel overhead in silent communion. Neither had slept much, Luke, because his mind churned with the weight of his decision. Ghost, because he seemed to sense that something momentous was approaching. The hunting knife lay across Luke's lap, its worn leather handle smooth from decades of use. It had belonged to his father, passed down through generations of men who had understood that sometimes the most difficult cuts were also the most necessary. The blade caught the early morning light, reflecting it back like a promise or a threat, depending on one's perspective. Luke rose from his chair with the stiff movements of a man who had aged years in a single day. Ghost immediately came to his feet as well, yellow eyes alert and focused on his human companion's face. The wolf had learned to read Luke's moods with uncanny accuracy, and something in the man's posture told him that this morning was different from all the others they had shared. "Come on, boy," Luke said softly, his voice roughened by emotion and sleeplessness. "We need to take a walk." They made their way through the awakening town, past houses where smoke was beginning to rise from chimneys as families prepared for another day. A few early risers nodded respectfully to Luke, their expressions reflecting the community's collective embarrassment over the previous day's events. Ghost walked calmly at Luke's side, no longer the object of fear and suspicion, but somehow still carrying himself with the dignity of a creature who had faced death and emerged vindicated. The path led them to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open meadows and rolling hills that stretched toward the distant mountains. This was the boundary between the human world and the wild, the place where civilization ended and nature reclaimed its ancient authority. Luke had walked this path countless times over the past 3 years, but today it felt like a pilgrimage toward an inevitable destination. Ghost seemed to understand where they were going. His pace quickened slightly, and his head lifted to test the wind for scents that spoke of freedom and possibility. The wolf's ears pricked forward as they caught the distant howl of his wild cousins, a sound that had become increasingly rare as human settlement expanded into their territory. When they reached the old corral fence that marked the traditional edge of Silver Bend's influence, Luke stopped and turned to face his companion. Ghost sat immediately, his posture attentive but relaxed, trusting in Luke's judgment, even as something in the air told him that change was coming. Luke knelt down and took Ghost's massive head between his hands, looking directly into those intelligent yellow eyes that had become as familiar as his own reflection. For 3 years, those eyes had watched him with unwavering loyalty, had offered comfort during his darkest moments, had provided the companionship that kept him anchored to life when grief threatened to sweep him away. "You saved me," Luke said quietly, his voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "When Sarah died, I thought I was going to die too, just from the pain of missing her. But you gave me a reason to get up every morning, something to care for besides my own sorrow." Ghost's tail moved once, a subtle acknowledgement of the words, if not their meaning. The wolf had no understanding of human language, but he could hear the love and sadness in Luke's voice, could sense the enormous emotion that filled the space between them. Luke's hand went to the rope that had bound them together for 3 years, the frayed leather cord that had become a symbol of their partnership. His father's hunting knife felt heavy in his other hand, its weight representing not just the tool that would sever their physical connection, but the courage required to make the most selfless choice of his life. "But you were never meant to be tied to my world," he continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "You were meant to run free in the mountains, to hunt when and where your instincts tell you, to find a mate and raise pups who will know what it means to be truly wild." The distant howl came again, closer this time, and Ghost's ears swiveled toward the sound. For just a moment, his attention shifted from Luke to the hills, where his own kind called to him across the miles. It was a brief moment, but it told Luke everything he needed to know about the choice he was making. Around Ghost's neck, the simple rope collar bore a small metal tag that Luke had fashioned years ago, engraved with a single word: friend. It was a designation that had meant everything during their time together, but now it seemed inadequate to describe the depth of their bond. They had been more than friends, they had been family, companions, fellow survivors of loss and loneliness. But family, Luke had learned from Sarah, sometimes meant knowing when to let go. Luke's hands trembled as he drew the hunting knife from its sheath, the morning sun catching the blade and sending fractures of light dancing across Ghost's grey coat. The wolf remained perfectly still, sensing the gravity of the moment, even without understanding its full implications. His yellow eyes never left Luke's face, filled with the trust that had defined their relationship from the very beginning. The rope that had bound them together for 3 years felt different in Luke's hands now, not like a symbol of companionship, but like a chain that had kept a magnificent creature from fulfilling his true purpose. Luke could see the wear patterns in the leather, the places where Ghost's strength had tested its limits during moments of excitement or alarm. It was strong enough to hold him, but not strong enough to contain what he was meant to become. "I need you to understand something," Luke said, his voice steady despite the tears that blurred his vision. "This isn't because I don't love you. This is because I do." He placed the knife against the rope, feeling the sharp edge bite into the leather fibers. One clean cut would sever the physical bond between them, but Luke knew that some connections transcended rope and collar, that love could exist without possession. As the knife sliced through the final strands, the rope fell away from Ghost's neck with a soft whisper, landing in the grass at their feet like a discarded skin. The metal tag engraved with the simple word "friend" caught the morning light as it tumbled free, a small piece of shaped metal that had carried such weight and meaning. Ghost looked down at the fallen rope, then back up at Luke with an expression that seemed almost puzzled. For 3 years, that rope had been a constant presence, a reminder of his place in the human world. Now its absence created a void that neither of them quite knew how to fill. Luke reached out and gently removed the collar from Ghost's neck, his fingers lingering on the wolf's thick fur for what he knew would be the last time. The moment felt sacred, like a baptism in reverse. Instead of welcoming someone into a community, he was releasing them back to their natural state. "You're free now," Luke whispered, stepping back to give Ghost space to process this new reality. "Free to go wherever your heart tells you to go, free to be what you were always meant to be." Ghost stood slowly, shaking his head as if to confirm that the familiar weight around his neck was truly gone. He took a tentative step toward the hills, then stopped and looked back at Luke with an expression that seemed to ask if this was real, if the freedom he had been given was genuine. Luke nodded encouragingly, though each gesture cost him more than he could have imagined. "Go on, boy. Your family is calling." As if summoned by his words, another howl echoed across the valley, closer and more insistent than before. Ghost's ears pricked forward, and for the first time since Luke had known him, the wolf's attention was completely focused on something other than his human companion. The call of the wild was stronger than any rope, more compelling than any collar. Ghost took another step toward the hills, his movements becoming more confident as the reality of his freedom settled into his consciousness. But then he stopped and turned back to Luke one final time, and in that moment, the man and the wolf shared a look that transcended species and spoke to the deepest truths about love and sacrifice. Luke saw acknowledgement in those yellow eyes, understanding, and perhaps even gratitude. Ghost might not comprehend the human concepts of choice and sacrifice, but he understood that something significant had changed, that the man who had saved his life was now giving him something even more precious. "I'll never forget you," Luke said, his voice breaking on the words. "You saved my life in ways you'll never know. Now go live yours." Ghost turned toward the hills one last time, his body language shifting from domesticated companion to wild predator in the space of a heartbeat. His gait changed, becoming looser and more fluid, as if muscles that had been constrained by civilization were remembering their original purpose. Luke watched as Ghost padded up the hillside with increasing confidence, the wolf's grey coat blending with the morning shadows until he became part of the landscape itself. At the crest of the hill, Ghost paused and looked back one final time, a silhouette against the brightening sky. Then he was gone, disappearing over the ridge and into the wild lands beyond, following the ancient call of his kind toward a freedom that Luke had finally found the courage to give him. Luke sank to his knees in the grass, his strength suddenly gone as the magnitude of his sacrifice hit him with full force. The abandoned rope lay beside him, its purpose fulfilled and its meaning forever changed. He picked up the small metal tag, closing his fingers around it until the edges pressed into his palm. They had been friends for 3 years, but true friendship sometimes meant knowing when to say goodbye. 6 months had passed since the morning Luke set Ghost free, and Silver Bend had settled into the rhythm of another season. Winter had given way to spring, and now the hills surrounding the town bloomed with wildflowers that reminded Luke of Sarah's garden. The scandal of Tom Henley's deception had faded into local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of fear and the importance of seeking truth before passing judgment. Luke continued to work the surrounding ranches, his reputation enhanced rather than diminished by the events that had nearly cost Ghost his life. The townspeople treated him with a new respect, recognizing in his sacrifice a nobility that few among them could claim to possess. He had proven Ghost's innocence and then, in an act that surprised everyone, had chosen to set his companion free rather than claim the vindication he had fought so hard to achieve. The small cabin on the outskirts of town remained much as it had been during Ghost's time there, though Luke had made one significant addition. A new rope hung coiled on his saddle, never used but always present a symbol of hope for future companionship while honoring the memory of what had been lost. He had not replaced Ghost, nor did he intend to. Some bonds were too profound to duplicate, too meaningful to attempt again. On this particular morning, Luke was preparing to ride out to the Morrison Ranch when he noticed a small figure approaching along the dusty path. Billy Morrison, now 17, and showing the promise of the man he would become, walked with the purposeful stride of someone carrying important news. "Mr. Merrick," Billy called out as he drew near, "my pa sent me to fetch you. We've got a situation that requires your particular expertise." Luke secured the new rope to his saddle and turned to face the young man with curiosity. In the months since Ghost's release, Luke had developed a reputation as someone who understood the delicate balance between human needs and wildlife preservation. Ranchers throughout the valley had begun consulting him when conflicts arose with wild animals, trusting his judgment and his ability to find solutions that didn't require violence. "What kind of situation?" Luke asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Orphaned colt," Billy explained. "Found him yesterday morning near Dead Horse Creek, maybe 3 days old, and no mama in sight. Pa thinks she might have been taken by wolves or mountain lions. The little fellow's in bad shape, but Pa remembered what you did with your wolf. Thought you might know how to help." Luke felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the recognition of a creature in need and his own ability to provide assistance. It was the same feeling that had moved him to rescue Ghost all those years ago, the same impulse that Sarah had nurtured and encouraged throughout their marriage. The ride to the Morrison Ranch took them through country that Luke knew intimately, past places where he and Ghost had walked together during their years of companionship. Occasionally, Luke thought he caught glimpses of grey fur in the distant hills, and sometimes the wind carried howls that might have contained a familiar note. Whether these sightings were real or wishful thinking, he couldn't say, but they brought him comfort nonetheless. The orphaned colt was indeed in desperate condition, a bay foal with white markings who couldn't have been more than a few days old. He lay in the shade of the barn, too weak to stand but still possessing the spark of life that separated the salvageable from the lost. Luke knelt beside the animal, running experienced hands over its small frame and assessing its chances for survival. "He'll need feeding every 2 hours," Luke told Billy and his father. "Special milk mixture, gentle handling, warmth at night. It's going to be touch and go for the first few weeks." "Will you help us?" Billy asked. "Pa and I, we don't know much about raising orphans." Luke looked down at the foal, seeing in its struggle an echo of his own journey from loss to healing. This was different from his relationship with Ghost. This was about nurturing a domestic animal rather than caring for a wild predator, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Every living creature deserved a chance, deserved someone willing to fight for its survival. "I'll help," he said simply. As the weeks passed, Luke found himself spending increasing amounts of time at the Morrison Ranch, tending to the orphaned colt and teaching Billy the skills necessary for its care. The young man proved to be a dedicated student, showing the same gentle patience that Luke remembered from his own early days with Ghost. The colt thrived under their combined attention, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. But more importantly, Luke discovered that caring for another creature had begun to heal wounds he hadn't realized were still bleeding. The act of nurturing, of taking responsibility for something helpless and vulnerable, reconnected him to the part of himself that Sarah had loved most. One evening, as they finished the colt's feeding routine, Billy looked up at Luke with the serious expression of a young man grappling with adult concepts. "Mr. Merrick, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret letting Ghost go? Do you ever wish you'd kept him close instead of setting him free?" Luke considered the question carefully, watching the sunset paint the western hills in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in those hills, Ghost was living the life he had been born to live, running free with his own kind, hunting when and where his instincts demanded. "No," Luke said finally. "Love isn't about keeping someone close because it makes you happy. Love is about wanting what's best for them, even when it breaks your heart to let them go." Billy nodded thoughtfully, and Luke could see the young man filing away the lesson for future use. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Luke caught sight of a familiar silhouette on a distant ridge, a large grey wolf, magnificent and wild, watching them for a moment before disappearing into the gathering darkness. Luke smiled and touched the new rope coiled on his saddle, understanding that some bonds transcended physical presence, that love could endure in freedom as well as captivity. Ghost was home now, living the life he was meant to live, and that knowledge brought Luke a peace deeper than possession